In 1582, in the small village of St. Osyth, Essex, England, a poor widow named Ursula Kemp made her living as a healer, using herbs and traditional remedies to help neighbors the village doctor couldn't cure. When a woman she'd helped refused to pay, Ursula spoke angry words, and days later, that woman fell mysteriously ill. Whispers of witchcraft spread. A magistrate arrived seeking glory by hunting witches. Then came the most devastating betrayal. Ursula's own 8-year-old son, terrified and manipulated, testified that his mother kept 4 demonic spirits, cats and a toad, who did evil at her command. Ursula was hanged on August 2, 1582, her body buried with iron stakes driven through her bones to prevent her spirit from rising. For 429 years, those bones remained lost until farmers discovered them in 1921, the iron stakes still embedded, a grim reminder of how fear and superstition murdered an innocent woman. This is the true story of Ursula Kemp. Not a witch, but a healer, destroyed by the very community she served. St. Osyth was a small coastal village in Essex, England, in the late 16th century. A place of perhaps a few hundred souls living in timber-framed cottages, farming the land, fishing the North Sea, and attending the parish church that dominated the village centre. Life was hard, short, and filled with dangers that medicine of the era could do little to address. Ursula Kemp, known to some as Ursula, was a widow living in poverty with her young son, Thomas. Her husband had died years earlier, leaving her to survive however she could in a society that offered women limited options for earning a living. She was perhaps in her 40s, middle-aged by 16th century standards, and had acquired knowledge of traditional healing through observation, experience, and perhaps teaching from older women in the community. Her reputation as a healer was well established. People came to her when they or their children fell ill, when injuries wouldn't heal, when women faced difficult pregnancies or childbirth. Ursula knew which herbs could reduce fever, which poultices might draw out infection, which teas could ease pain. This knowledge, accumulated over generations and passed from woman to woman, was the primary healthcare available to poor villagers who couldn't afford expensive physicians. She was particularly known for her skill with unwishing, the practice of removing curses or evil spells that people believed had been placed on them. In an era when misfortune was often attributed to supernatural causes, someone who could supposedly undo malicious magic was valuable. Whether Ursula genuinely believed in her ability to counter curses, or simply understood the psychological power of ritual and reassurance, is unknowable. Childbirth assistance was another crucial service. In 16th century England, childbirth was dangerous, often fatal to mother, child, or both. Midwives and healing women like Ursula provided the only assistance available. Her presence during labor, her knowledge of positioning and techniques to ease delivery, her herbal remedies to manage pain or bleeding, all potentially saved lives. But the line between healer and witch was perilously thin. The very knowledge that made Ursula valuable also made her suspect. How did she know which herbs to use? How could she remove curses unless she had dealings with supernatural forces herself? In a deeply superstitious society, expertise could seem like witchcraft, and helping people could be reinterpreted as having power over them. Ursula's poverty made her vulnerable. She depended on payments from those she helped, sometimes money, more often food, cloth, or other goods in barter. When people didn't pay, she had little recourse. She couldn't sue in courts that favored the wealthy. She could only express anger or frustration, and even this could be dangerous if her words were later blamed for subsequent misfortunes. Her relationship with Grace Thurlow, a neighbor, would prove fatal. The details vary across historical accounts, but the basic story is consistent. Grace sought Ursula's help for her sick child. Ursula provided treatment, herbs, perhaps prayers or charms, and the child recovered. But Grace, whether from genuine poverty or simple unwillingness, didn't pay the agreed-upon fee. Ursula, understandably angry at being cheated after successfully healing Grace's child, spoke harsh words. Exactly what she said isn't recorded, but the implication was clear. Grace would regret her ingratitude. In normal times, this would be dismissed as an angry person venting frustration. But these weren't normal times. Soon after this confrontation, Grace began experiencing misfortunes. She fell ill with mysterious symptoms. Small accidents plagued her household. Perhaps these were pure coincidence. Life in the 16th century was full of illness and accidents. Perhaps Grace, feeling guilty about not paying Ursula, became hypervigilant about every minor problem, interpreting normal misfortune as supernatural punishment. Whatever the cause, Grace became convinced that Ursula had cursed her, had used witchcraft to punish her for not paying. In Grace's mind, the anger Ursula had expressed wasn't just words, but actual magical attack. And in 1582 England, accusations of witchcraft were taken very seriously indeed. The timing was particularly dangerous. England was in the grip of witch-hunting fever. The Witchcraft Act of 1563 had made witchcraft a felony, punishable by death. Witch trials were becoming common, driven by genuine fear of maleficium, harmful magic, by religious fervor following the Reformation, and by ambitious officials seeking to advance their careers by prosecuting witches. Grace Thurlow's suspicions about Ursula didn't remain private. She began sharing her fears with other neighbors, and in the close-knit, gossipy environment of a small village, the story spread rapidly. Each retelling likely added embellishments, and soon other villagers were remembering their own interactions with Ursula through a new, sinister lens. Had anyone else fallen ill after arguing with Ursula? Had livestock died after she'd been angry with their owners? Had accidents befallen people who'd crossed her? In the paranoid atmosphere of witch-hunting era, people reinterpreted ordinary misfortunes as evidence of malevolent magic. Correlation became causation in minds primed to see supernatural evil. The psychology of witch accusations followed predictable patterns. Once someone was suspected, confirmation bias ensured that people noticed evidence supporting the accusation while dismissing anything contradicting it. If someone Ursula had helped recovered, that was just her doing her job. But if someone she'd argued with later suffered misfortune, that was witchcraft. The same actions were interpreted differently, depending on whether the interpreter had already concluded Ursula was a witch. Grace's accusations gained credibility because they fit expectations about how witches operated. According to popular belief, witches used their powers to punish those who offended them. They were vindictive, attacking people over petty grievances. Grace's story, healer becomes angry when not paid, uses magic to punish the ingrate, matched the witch narrative perfectly. Other villagers began coming forward with their own suspicions and accusations. Perhaps some genuinely believed Ursula had harmed them through magic. Others might have seen an opportunity to explain their own problems by blaming someone else. And some might have had old grudges against Ursula that now seemed safe to express when she was already under suspicion. The accumulation of accusations created a kind of social proof. When one person accuses someone of witchcraft, they might be dismissed as paranoid or motivated by personal animosity. But when multiple people make similar accusations, it seems more credible. Surely all these people couldn't be wrong. The village was developing a consensus that Ursula Kemp was a witch. Ursula's own behavior probably contributed to the suspicions against her. She likely defended herself forcefully, insisting she'd done nothing wrong and that her accusers were ungrateful liars. But vehement denial could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. A witch would naturally deny accusations. If she showed anger at her accusers, that anger could be seen as threatening, a witch showing her true malevolent nature. She had no good options. Admit to being a witch and face execution. Deny and be accused of lying. Try to flee and confirm guilt through flight. Stay and face a community increasingly convinced of her evil nature. Every choice carried terrible risks, and she was navigating them alone, without resources, education, or powerful allies. The village atmosphere became poisonous for Ursula. Neighbors who had once sought her help now avoided her. People crossed the street rather than pass too close. Parents kept children away from her.
She was being socially isolated, marked as dangerous,
transformed from healer to threat through nothing more than rumors and reinterpretation of her actions. The whispers reached the ears of local authorities. In 1582, English law required that suspected witches be investigated and, if evidence warranted, tried and punished. The responsibility for investigating fell to local magistrates, men of some education and social standing who served as justices of the peace and handled various legal matters in their districts. The magistrate assigned to investigate the witchcraft allegations in St. Osyth was Brian Darcy. This appointment would seal Ursula's fate, because Darcy was not a neutral investigator seeking truth, but an ambitious man who saw witch hunting as a path to recognition and advancement.
Darcy believed in witchcraft absolutely,
and saw himself as a warrior against satanic forces. He was zealous, thorough, and convinced that witches were everywhere, requiring vigorous prosecution. He brought to the investigation not skepticism or judicial caution, but determination to find and punish witches. When such a man received allegations about Ursula Kemp, her doom was likely already sealed. The investigation was about to begin, and it would follow patterns that had destroyed many innocent people across Europe. Patterns designed not to determine truth, but to confirm predetermined conclusions of guilt. Brian Darcy arrived in St. Osyth with authority, purpose, and an unshakable belief that he was doing God's work by rooting out witches. He was educated, articulate, and skilled at conducting interrogations that produced the results he wanted. His career would be built on witch prosecutions, and the St. Osyth case would be one of his most famous. Darcy's methodology reflected the witch-hunting manuals of the era, particularly the influential work Daemonology by King James I, published later but reflecting beliefs already widespread. These texts taught that witches made pacts with the devil, received familiar spirits to do their bidding, and used magic to harm their neighbors. Darcy's investigation would be designed to prove these elements. He began by interviewing Grace Thurlow, who repeated her accusations with increasing elaboration. Under Darcy's encouraging questioning, her story became more detailed and damning. She described specific symptoms of her mysterious illness, recalled ominous encounters with Ursula before falling sick, and interpreted every misfortune as magical attack. Darcy then sought additional witnesses. He interviewed other villagers who had complaints against Ursula or who claimed to have been bewitched. The process was leading and suggestive. Darcy wasn't neutrally gathering information, but actively shaping testimony to build a case. When witnesses were uncertain, he helped them remember. When their accounts were vague, he encouraged specificity. The concept of familiar spirits was central to English witchcraft beliefs. Witches supposedly kept small animals, cats, dogs, toads, mice, that were actually demons in animal form. These familiars served the witch, carrying out malevolent tasks in exchange for being fed with the witch's blood.
Finding evidence of familiars was crucial to proving witchcraft. Darcy ordered a search of Ursula's cottage. The searchers were looking for animals that might be familiars, for suspicious objects that might be used in magic, for anything unusual or inexplicable that could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. In a poor widow's cottage, they found what they were looking for. Or, rather, they interpreted what they found through the lens of suspicion. Ursula kept cats, as many people did, for pest control. She might have had other small animals. In normal circumstances, these would be unremarkable. But to searchers primed to find familiars, every cat became potentially demonic. Did the cats seem unusually well fed? Evidence the witch fed them blood. Did they seem attached to Ursula? Evidence of unnatural bonds between witch and familiar. The searchers also examined Ursula's body, searching for the witch's mark, a supposedly supernatural spot where the devil had touched her, or where familiars suckled. Any mole, birthmark, scar, or skin irregularity could be interpreted as such a mark. This invasive, humiliating examination violated Ursula's body and dignity, while providing evidence that was actually meaningless. Darcy was building a case methodically, accumulating testimony and physical evidence that would convince a court. But the most devastating evidence would come from the most unexpected source: Ursula's own child. Thomas Kemp was approximately 8 years old, living with his mother in poverty, probably confused and frightened by the sudden attention and hostility directed at his family. Darcy recognized that the child could provide crucial testimony, and he set about extracting it through means that were manipulative even by the standards of the time. Children were considered credible witnesses in witchcraft cases. Their supposed innocence made them less likely to lie, and witches were believed to involve their own children in their dark practices. A child testifying against a parent was seen as particularly convincing evidence. Surely no child would condemn their own mother unless the accusations were true. Darcy isolated Thomas from his mother and questioned him repeatedly. The methods used aren't fully documented, but they likely involved a combination of leading questions, promises of safety if he told the truth, threats of punishment if he lied or protected his mother, and suggestions about what he must have seen. An 8-year-old child, frightened and confused, facing an intimidating authority figure, would be highly susceptible to this pressure. The testimony Darcy extracted from Thomas would become the centerpiece of the case against Ursula. The boy told Darcy that his mother kept 4 familiar spirits: 2 cats named Tiffin and Titty, a toad called Pie Wacket, and a lamb named Jack. He claimed these animals did his mother's bidding, going out to harm people she was angry with. He described feeding them and witnessing their supernatural activities. Whether Thomas genuinely believed what he was saying, whether he was repeating what Darcy had suggested to him, or whether he was simply telling the interrogator what he thought would make the frightening questioning stop, we cannot know. What's certain is that an 8-year-old's testimony, obtained under pressure from an authority figure, was treated as reliable evidence against his mother. The moment when Thomas Kemp testified against his mother represented a tragedy within the larger tragedy. A child, weaponized against his parent, his words twisted into evidence for her execution. Understanding how this happened requires understanding both the vulnerability of children to suggestion and the ruthlessness of witch hunters like Darcy. Thomas was taken from his mother and questioned separately, probably multiple times over several days. Each session would have been intimidating. A small boy alone with educated, powerful men who controlled his fate and his mother's. Darcy was experienced at interrogation and knew how to manipulate witnesses, especially children. The questioning likely began with seemingly innocent questions. "Your mother keeps cats, doesn't she? What are their names? Does she talk to them?
Does she feed them special things? Each answer led to more specific, more leading questions that gradually built a narrative of witchcraft. Children are highly susceptible to leading questions, especially when they come from authority figures. Modern psychological research has demonstrated this repeatedly. But Darcy didn't need modern research. He knew from experience that children could be guided to say what he needed them to say. The names Thomas gave for the supposed familiars, Tiffin, Titty, Pyewacket, and Jack, might have been actual names Ursula used for her cats and other animals, or they might have been suggested by Darcy, drawn from folklore or previous witch trials. The lamb named Jack was particularly suspicious, as lambs weren't typically kept as pets in poor households. Thomas described how these animals would leave the house at night to do his mother's evil work, how they returned and reported their activities to her, how she fed them and gave them instructions. This narrative matched perfectly with contemporary beliefs about how witches and familiars operated. Almost too perfectly, suggesting it was shaped by Darcy's expectations rather than arising from Thomas's genuine observations. The psychological pressure on the child must have been enormous. He probably understood that his mother was in terrible trouble. He might have been told that if he told the truth, things would be better for her. A cruel lie that made him complicit in her condemnation. Or he might have been threatened with punishment himself if he didn't cooperate, making self-preservation override loyalty to his mother. Children also want to please authority figures and may say what they think is expected. If Thomas sensed that Darcy wanted to hear about familiars and witchcraft, he might have provided those details simply to satisfy the interrogator and end the frightening questioning sessions. The content of Thomas's testimony reflected contemporary witch beliefs in ways an 8-year-old wouldn't naturally know unless coached. He described the familiars suckling blood from his mother's body. He knew their supposed names and roles. He could recount specific instances of their malevolent activities. This detailed knowledge of witch lore suggests adult influence shaping his testimony. When Thomas's testimony was presented to Ursula, her response is recorded in the trial documents. She was devastated that her own child had condemned her, though she denied the specific accusations. The betrayal by her son added emotional torment to the physical and legal danger she faced. We should feel sympathy for Thomas as well as for Ursula. He was a child placed in an impossible situation, manipulated by adults pursuing their own agendas, forced to participate in his mother's destruction. The psychological damage this caused him, if he lived long enough to understand what he'd done, must have been severe. He was as much a victim of the witch hunt as his mother, though in different ways. The use of Thomas's testimony reflected the broader corruption of witch trials. Justice requires neutral fact-finding, protection of the accused's rights, and presumption of innocence. Instead, witch trials featured leading interrogations, coerced testimony from vulnerable witnesses, and presumption of guilt. The entire process was designed to confirm suspicions rather than test them. After Thomas testified, Ursula was formally arrested and taken to jail to await trial. She was removed from her home, separated from her son, and imprisoned in conditions that were harsh even by 16th century standards. The cell would have been dark, cold, unsanitary, and frightening, designed to break the spirit of prisoners and make them more amenable to confession. In the grim darkness of her jail cell, Ursula Kemp faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: maintain her innocence and face almost certain conviction based on the testimony against her, or confess and possibly receive mercy. The pressure to confess was psychological, legal, and spiritual. Brian Darcy visited Ursula in prison, bringing with him the accumulated weight of accusation, testimony, and supposed evidence. He told her that the case against her was overwhelming. Her own son had testified, multiple neighbors had accused her, Physical evidence had been found. Denial was pointless. Her only hope was confession and repentance. Darcy likely promised that confession would lead to leniency, or at least to a quicker, less painful death. This was a common tactic in witch interrogations, offering the illusion of choice between terrible options. The promise of mercy for confession was often hollow, but desperate prisoners clung to any hope. The threat was equally clear. If she didn't confess voluntarily, other means would be used to extract confession.
While England didn't use torture as extensively as continental Europe in witch trials, psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and harsh imprisonment conditions could break a person's will without technically qualifying as torture. Ursula was also told that confessing would protect her soul. Contemporary religious belief held that dying with unconfessed sins on one's soul meant damnation. If she was guilty of witchcraft, dying without confession meant eternal torment. This spiritual threat could be more terrifying than physical punishment for someone who genuinely believed in hell. Under this enormous pressure, isolated from any support or counsel, Ursula eventually began to confess.
The confession she gave contained elements that were probably true, mixed with impossible claims that she almost certainly didn't believe, but knew her interrogators wanted to hear. She admitted to practicing healing and to having knowledge of herbs and remedies. This was true. It was how she'd made her living. But under Darcy's shaping questions, this healing became reinterpreted as maleficent magic. Curing someone became evidence of having power to harm them. She confessed to keeping familiars, the cats and toad that Thomas had named. She described feeding them and sending them out to harm people she was angry with. She named specific victims and described the illnesses or misfortunes the familiars had supposedly caused. This part of her confession was almost certainly false, coerced by the desire to tell Darcy what he wanted to hear and end the interrogation. Most damningly, she named other women in the village as fellow witches. This was exactly what Darcy hoped for, a confession that would lead to more arrests and more trials. Witch hunters believed in conspiracies of witches working together, and getting one accused witch to name others validated that belief and generated new cases to prosecute. The women Ursula named, Elizabeth Bennet and others, were probably just other village women with whom she'd had passing acquaintance or minor conflicts. Under pressure to name accomplices, she likely picked people who had some feature that could make them plausible targets. They were old, poor, lived alone, had reputations as healers, or had been involved in village disputes. This aspect of witch hunting was particularly insidious. It created cascading accusations. One confession led to more arrests, which led to more interrogations and confessions, which led to still more arrests. A single accusation could metastasize into a witch panic affecting dozens of people. Ursula's confession, once given, became the most powerful evidence against her. In 16th century legal thinking, confession was considered the queen of proofs, the most certain evidence of guilt. The fact that confessions were often coerced through pressure, promises, or torture was ignored or rationalized. A confession proved guilt regardless of how it was obtained. The content of the confession mattered less than the fact of having confessed. Even if Ursula later recanted or tried to explain that she'd only confessed because she was pressured, the recantation would be dismissed as the devil encouraging her to return to lies. There was no escape once confession had been extracted. Darcy had what he needed. He had testimony from neighbors, physical evidence in the form of supposed familiars and witches' marks, testimony from Ursula's own child, and now a confession from Ursula herself. The case was complete. It was time for trial. In March 1582, Ursula Kemp and the other women she had named were brought to trial at Chelmsford, the county town of Essex. The trial would be a mockery of justice by modern standards, but it followed the legal procedures of its time, procedures designed to convict rather than to determine truth. The courthouse was packed with spectators. Witch trials were public entertainment, drawing crowds eager to see accused witches face judgment. The atmosphere was hostile. Most attendees had already concluded the defendants were guilty and wanted to see justice, as they understood it, done. The judge presiding over the trial was not a neutral arbiter, but an active participant in the prosecution. Judges in witch trials believed in witchcraft, feared its dangers, and saw their role as protecting society from malevolent magic. They examined witnesses, questioned defendants, and shaped proceedings to achieve conviction. Ursula and her co-defendants had no lawyers defending them. Legal representation for the accused wasn't standard practice in 16th-century criminal trials, especially not for poor defendants accused of serious crimes. They had to defend themselves against charges they didn't fully understand, using legal procedures they had no training in, before judges and juries, already convinced of their guilt. The prosecution presented its evidence in damning sequence. First came the testimony of accusers, Grace Thurlow, and others who claimed to have been bewitched by Ursula. They described mysterious illnesses, sudden misfortunes, and the temporal connection between arguments with Ursula and subsequent problems. This testimony relied entirely on correlation, presented as causation. I argued with Ursula on Monday. On Wednesday, I fell ill. Therefore, Ursula bewitched me. The logical fallacy was obvious, but in the context of widespread belief in witchcraft, it seemed convincing. People got sick all the time. But when sickness followed conflict with a suspected witch, it became evidence of magic. Thomas Kemp's testimony was presented as particularly credible. A child testifying against his mother seemed too terrible to be false. Surely no mother would allow her child to witness witchcraft unless she actually practiced it. The court didn't consider that the child might have been coached, frightened, or manipulated into saying what interrogators wanted. The supposed physical evidence was presented, descriptions of Ursula's cats and other animals as demonic familiars, the witch's marks found on her body, items from her cottage interpreted as magical implements. Each piece of evidence was mundane: cats, moles, household objects, but interpretation transformed them into proof of supernatural evil. Then came Ursula's own confession, read aloud to the court. Her admission of keeping familiars, sending them to harm people, conspiring with other witches, all recorded in damning detail. The fact that this confession had been extracted under pressure wasn't mentioned. It stood as conclusive proof of guilt. Ursula tried to defend herself, to explain that the confession was coerced, that her cats were just cats, that she'd only tried to help people, not harm them. But her protestations were dismissed as lies, or as the devil speaking through her to avoid justice. Every attempt at defense became additional evidence of guilt. The trial was brief. Unlike modern trials that might last days or weeks, witch trials often concluded in hours. There was little deliberation. The outcome was predetermined by the accumulation of accusation and confession. The jury, composed of local men, likely needed little time to reach their verdict. Guilty. On all charges. Ursula Kemp was convicted of using witchcraft to cause the deaths of several people through malevolent magic. The sentence was death by hanging, the standard punishment for felony witchcraft under English law. The other women she'd named were also tried, and most were convicted based on similar evidence and similar coerced confessions. The St. Osyth witch trials of 1582 would eventually involve multiple executions, making it one of the larger witch-hunting episodes in Essex history. When the sentence was pronounced, Ursula knew she had no hope. There was no appeal process, no higher court to review the verdict, no possibility of pardon. She would be taken from the court to await execution, which would follow within days or weeks.
Her time was measured in hours. August 2nd, 1582, dawned with Ursula Kemp preparing to die. She had spent months in prison since her conviction, held in darkness and filth while arrangements were made for her execution and while other suspected witches were investigated and tried. Now her time had come. The execution would be public, as all executions were in 16th century England. Public execution served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the power of law and order. It provided deterrence by showing the consequences of crime. And it satisfied the public's demand for justice and entertainment. Executions were social events, drawing crowds from miles around. Ursula was brought from her cell and loaded onto a cart that would take her to the execution site. The journey through streets lined with spectators was part of the punishment, a final humiliation as the condemned was displayed to the public. People shouted, jeered, or prayed, depending on their disposition and relationship to the condemned. The execution ground was an open area outside town where the gallows stood, a simple wooden structure consisting of a vertical post and a horizontal beam from which the rope would hang. The gallows was permanent, used regularly for various executions, a grim landmark that reminded everyone of the consequences of crime. Thousands had gathered to witness Ursula's death. In the crowd were people who had known her, people who had accused her, people who simply wanted to see a witch hang. The atmosphere mixed carnival and solemnity. Vendors sold food and drink, children played, adults gossiped. But underlying it all was the serious purpose of watching justice done. Ursula was allowed to speak final words, a tradition that gave the condemned a chance to confess sins, proclaim innocence, or make peace with God and the watching crowd. What she said isn't recorded in detail, but she likely maintained her innocence while also expressing repentance for any sins, a delicate balance aimed at saving her soul, if not her life. A minister attended her, urging her to confess fully and repent sincerely to save her soul from damnation. This spiritual counsel was meant as mercy, but it added psychological pressure even in her final moments. If she maintained innocence, she risked dying with unconfessed sins. If she confessed to witchcraft she hadn't committed, she died with a lie on her lips. The executioner placed the noose around her neck. Hanging in 16th century England wasn't the relatively quick death by dropped weight that later became standard. Instead, the condemned stood on a cart or ladder. The noose was secured, and then the support was removed, leaving them to strangle slowly as their own body weight tightened the rope. When the moment came, the cart was pulled away. Ursula dropped, the rope tightened, and she began the agonizing process of strangulation. Death could take many minutes as consciousness faded and the body struggled for air it couldn't get. Friends or family sometimes pulled on the legs to speed death, but whether anyone did this for Ursula isn't recorded. Finally, she was dead. Her body hung from the gallows for a time as a warning and spectacle, then was cut down. But unlike many executed criminals who were given Christian burial after execution, Ursula faced additional punishment, even in death. The church refused to allow her body to be buried in consecrated ground. As a convicted witch, she was considered too evil to rest in the churchyard alongside Christians. Instead, her body was taken to an unmarked location and buried without ceremony, probably in a crossroads or wasteland deemed appropriate for criminals and outcasts. But even this wasn't the final indignity. Following folk belief about preventing witches from rising from their graves, iron stakes were driven through her bones before burial. These stakes, hammered through her skeleton, were supposed to pin her to the earth and prevent her spirit from walking, or her body from being reanimated by demonic forces. Ursula Kemp, who had spent her life helping her neighbors, was buried like a monster, her bones pierced with iron,
in an unmarked grave that was meant to be forgotten. The fear of witchcraft was so powerful that even her corpse was treated as dangerous. The execution and burial of Ursula Kemp might have been the end of her story, a forgotten episode of injustice among many such episodes in the witch-hunting era. But her story wasn't over. The iron stakes driven through her bones would, centuries later, become the key to rediscovering her story and finally giving her justice. In 1921, more than 330 years after Ursula Kemp's execution, a farmer plowing fields near St. Osyth made a startling discovery: human remains buried shallow in the earth. When archaeologists were called to examine the site, they found not one, but two skeletons, both showing signs of having been buried hastily and without ceremony. What made the discovery extraordinary were the iron stakes driven through the bones. One skeleton had stakes piercing through the major joints, the knees, the elbows, possibly the wrists. These weren't accidental inclusions or agricultural debris, but deliberate artifacts, carefully positioned to penetrate the skeleton and hold it in place. The second skeleton showed similar treatment, though the preservation was less complete. These two burials, with their iron stakes and lack of Christian burial markers, immediately suggested victims of execution rather than normal deaths. The location near St. Osyth and the dating of the burials pointed to a specific historical context. Local historians and archaeologists connected the discovery to documented witch trials in St. Osyth. Records from 1582 described the execution of several women for witchcraft, including Ursula Kemp and Elizabeth Bennet. The two staked skeletons were almost certainly these executed witches, buried in shame and treated with post-mortem protection against their supposedly evil spirits. The iron stakes were particularly significant as evidence of deep fear. Staking bodies was a folk practice aimed at preventing the dead from walking. Ghosts, revenants, and malevolent spirits were believed to be unable to rise if iron pinned them to the earth. That this was done to Ursula and Elizabeth showed how terrified the community was of them, even in death. The discovery generated enormous public interest. The 1920s saw renewed fascination with witchcraft, both scholarly and popular. The idea of actual witch remains, complete with anti-revenant measures, captured imaginations. Newspapers covered the story, and the bones became minor celebrities. But what should be done with these remains? They were human beings who deserved respectful treatment. But they were also historical artifacts that could provide research opportunities. And there was the darker appeal of exhibiting bones with such a macabre history. The skeletons eventually ended up in the hands of collectors, and then in the Museum of Witchcraft, first in the Isle of Man, and later in Boscastle, Cornwall. The museum specialized in witchcraft-related artifacts, and having actual witch remains, or at least remains of people executed as witches, was a major attraction. For decades, visitors to the museum could see Ursula Kemp's bones displayed in a glass case, the iron stakes still embedded. The exhibit explained the history of the St. Osyth witch trials and showed the physical evidence of the fear and cruelty that had characterized witch hunting. But displaying human remains, especially those of people who had been victims of injustice, became increasingly controversial. Were these bones research materials, historical artifacts, or human remains deserving of burial? Did displaying them educate the public about past injustices, or did it perpetuate the spectacle and exploitation that had characterized Ursula's life and death? Some claimed the bones were cursed. Owners reported mysterious accidents, fires, and misfortunes that they attributed to Ursula's angry spirit. Whether these stories reflected genuine supernatural phenomena or were simply coincidences amplified by suggestion and expectation, they added to the bones' dark reputation. The curse stories might have been partly promotional, Museums and collectors benefited from the mystique of cursed objects, but they also reflected unease about how the remains were being treated. Perhaps the curse was simply moral discomfort manifesting as superstitious dread. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, attitudes toward displaying human remains had shifted significantly. Museums began repatriating remains to descendant communities, removing displays that seemed exploitative, and treating human bodies with more sensitivity and respect. Ursula's bones became part of this conversation. Advocates argued that Ursula Kemp deserved a proper burial after centuries of being treated as spectacle. She had been exploited in life, executed unjustly, buried in shame, and then dug up and displayed for profit. It was time to finally grant her dignity and rest. The Museum of Witchcraft, where Ursula Kemp's remains resided for many years, occupied an unusual position. It was simultaneously a serious research institution preserving historical materials and a tourist attraction trading on the mystique of the occult. Ursula's bones represented both aspects, being genuine historical artifacts and macabre curiosities. The museum's collection included thousands of items related to witchcraft, magic, and folk religion, spellbooks, ritual tools, charms, curses, and various objects associated with magical practice across centuries. But human remains were the most controversial items, raising ethical questions that the museum wrestled with for decades. Ursula's skeleton, with its embedded iron stakes, was displayed with explanatory materials about the St. Osyth witch trials, the mechanics of witch hunting, and the injustice done to accused witches. The museum's intent was educational, to teach visitors about a dark period of history and honor victims of persecution. But intent doesn't always determine impact. Some visitors found the display educational and moving, a stark reminder of how fear and superstition could lead to murder. Others found it disturbing or disrespectful, feeling that displaying executed people's bones, even with educational context, was exploitative. And some came simply for the thrill of seeing a real witch's skeleton, missing the historical and ethical complexity entirely. The curse stories accumulated over the years. The museum experienced fires that damaged portions of the collection. Owners reported accidents, illnesses, and financial troubles they attributed to cursed objects in the collection, particularly to Ursula's bones. Whether these misfortunes were genuinely unusual or simply normal life problems given supernatural interpretation is unknowable. The psychological power of curse beliefs shouldn't be dismissed entirely. If someone believes an object is cursed, they may become hypervigilant about problems, interpreting ordinary misfortune as supernatural, and possibly even unconsciously creating self-fulfilling prophecies through their expectations and behaviors. In 1999, the museum underwent ownership changes, and discussions about Ursula's remains became more urgent. Some scholars and activists began advocating for her reburial, arguing that she had been denied dignity in life and death and deserved finally to rest in peace, rather than remain on display. The campaign to rebury Ursula gained momentum through the 2000s. Articles in newspapers and discussions among historians, archaeologists, and ethicists addressed the question: what's the right thing to do with remains of people who were unjustly executed centuries ago? Display them to educate future generations about historical injustice. Bury them to finally grant them dignity. Supporters of reburial argued that Ursula had suffered enough indignity. She'd been falsely accused, forced to confess, publicly executed, buried in shame, pierced with iron stakes, dug up, and displayed to tourists. After 400+ years, she deserved rest. Continuing to exhibit her bones, even with good intentions, perpetuated her victimization. Those who favored continued preservation argued that the bones served important educational purposes. Seeing physical evidence of witch hunting's cruelty had impact that reading about it couldn't match. The bones were also valuable research materials that might yield additional information through modern analytical techniques. The debate reflected broader conversations about museum ethics, the treatment of human remains, and how to balance education and research with respect for the dead. Museums worldwide were grappling with similar questions about collections that included human bodies, particularly bodies of people from marginalized groups or victims of violence. Ursula's story also became a feminist touchstone. Many of those executed in witch hunts were women, often women who had some independence or knowledge that threatened patriarchal structures. Ursula was a widow, supporting herself through her healing knowledge. Exactly the kind of woman vulnerable to witchcraft accusations. Her story illustrated how gender, poverty, and specialized knowledge created deadly vulnerability. The recognition that witch hunting was often a form of violence against women added urgency to calls for respectful treatment of Ursula's remains. She deserved recognition not just as a historical curiosity, but as a victim of gender-based persecution who represented countless other women who suffered similar fates. In 2011, after decades of advocacy and debate, Ursula Kemp's remains were finally returned to St. Osyth for burial. The reburial ceremony represented official acknowledgement of the injustice done to her, and an attempt, however belated, to grant her the dignity she'd been denied for 429 years. The ceremony was small and private, attended by local historians, representatives from the museum that had held her remains, and community members who felt connection to Ursula's story. Unlike her execution, which had been a public spectacle, her reburial was quiet and respectful. The location chosen for burial wasn't the original gravesite, which was unknown and probably under modern development, but consecrated ground, the churchyard that had been denied to her after execution. This symbolic acceptance reversed the judgment that had declared her too evil to rest among Christians. A memorial marker was placed, simple but dignified, bearing her name and dates, with a brief inscription acknowledging the injustice of her execution. The marker serves as a place where people can remember her, leave flowers, and reflect on the tragedy of witch hunting and the importance of justice. The burial service included acknowledgement that Ursula was innocent, that she had been murdered by fear and superstition, and that her execution represented a profound failure of justice and humanity. This acknowledgement, while it couldn't undo the past, provided a form of historical correction. The official record now recognizes her as victim rather than criminal. The iron stakes that had pinned her bones for centuries were removed before reburial. These grim artifacts were preserved separately as historical evidence, but Ursula herself was allowed to rest without them. The symbolic importance of removing these markers of fear and cruelty was profound. Ursula Kemp's story has become an important historical lesson taught in schools, discussed in books and documentaries, and used to illustrate the dangers of moral panic, the importance of due process, and the terrible consequences of allowing fear to override reason and justice. The reflection on her story reveals a simple truth. Ursula wasn't a witch. She was a healer, a mother, a poor widow trying to survive through the knowledge she had. She was accused by neighbors who reinterpreted her help as harm, interrogated by an ambitious magistrate seeking glory, betrayed by her terrified son, and executed by a legal system designed to confirm suspicions rather than test them. Her story is one of thousands from the witch-hunting era across Europe and America. Most victims left no trace, their names forgotten, their bones lost. Ursula is remembered partly through accident of discovery, but also because her story so clearly illustrates the mechanisms of injustice that destroyed so many lives. The conclusion her story offers is both historical and contemporary.
truth eventually emerges, though it may take centuries. Ursula's innocence was clear to rational analysis even in 1582, but fear and superstition prevented people from seeing it. 400 years later, we finally acknowledged what should have been obvious all along. The educational message is vital. Guard against moral panic. Insist on real evidence and fair process. Resist the temptation to blame misfortune on scapegoats. And remember that fear is a terrible basis for justice. The witch hunts seem distant and irrational to modern eyes, but the psychological and social mechanisms that enabled them, fear of the other, willingness to believe accusations, pressure to conform to group consensus, desire to explain random misfortune, remain present in human nature. Ursula Kemp rests now in peace, no longer staked to the earth, no longer on display, no longer condemned. She lies in consecrated ground, acknowledged as innocent, remembered not as a witch, but as a victim who deserved better from her community and her era. May her rest be undisturbed, and may her story continue to teach future generations about the price of injustice and the importance of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit fear for power.